Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. This is Megan Carney. I'm the Communication Specialist with the North Pacific Landscape Conservation Cooperative, and I'm going to go over some logistics really quickly. So as you guys join the call, you are globally muted, so you don't have to worry about clicking that mute button there on the WebEx. And we are also recording today. A recording of this webinar will be available on our YouTube account and on our website after we're all done. And for questions, what we're going to do is wait until after Peter's presentation, and we'll probably keep everyone on mute just so it's not crazy, and feel free to either use the hand raise function or just send a message to NPLCC staff in the chat box, and then I'll relay those questions to Peter at the end of his presentation. And if you have any technical problems or anything, you can also send those in the chat box to NPLCC staff, and I'll try to help you out. And with that, I'm going to pass the floor over to John Mankowski for an introduction.
Can you hear me?
Sure can.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining this Science Management webinar. The North Pacific LCC is sponsoring this today. If you don't know, we're a self-directed partnership working in the coastal temperate rainforest region on natural and cultural resource conservation. We've got a large number of folks signed up for the webinar today with a huge, diverse array of people representing tribes and First Nations, conservation partners up in Canada, the U.S., from a variety of federal agencies. We have NGOs on today. We have other partnerships like Pacific Birds, American Bird Conservancy, consultants, and others. So a huge diversity of folks are interested in this topic today. And the topic really is centered around how we preserve and protect some of these unique dry habitat features that occur in this overall wet environment. These coastal Douglas-fir, oak woodland, prairie habitats, as we know, are unique and special as it relates to a variety of natural and cultural resource values. It also extends across border. This is an important issue to our Canadian partners as well as in the U.S. and in Washington and Oregon. So it's one of the reasons the MPLCC funded this work. It's transboundary, and it's been a priority for our conservation partners for some time. So I'm really happy to help open this session today. Dr. Peter Arces is the presenter today. He's the PI on this project. For those of you that don't know, he's a professor and the Forest Renewal BC Chair of Conservation of Biology in the Department of Forest and Conservation Science at University of British Columbia. He's also the Board Chair of Nature Trust BC. He's been working since the 80s on ecology, genetics, conservation of plant, animal, and bird populations in the Pacific Northwest. He's also spent time in Africa and the Andes, contributed to 3 books, 130 papers on demography, ecology, and genetics, well known in this region as an expert on collection and analysis of empirical data, design and monitoring of programs, and conservation biology. So please, it's really my pleasure, and please help me welcome Dr. Peter Arces as he makes this presentation today. He made this presentation to our steering committee not long ago up in Vancouver, and it was really clear that this really has a lot of management application to a huge number of you. So again, welcome, Peter, and go ahead and take it away.
John, thanks very much, and Megan, thanks for setting things up. Very kind introduction, and thanks all to everyone who's signed on today, especially given that we tried this unsuccessfully in the fall. It's nice to have you back. So to a bit of introduction, I'm going to talk today about some tools that have been developed in collaboration with quite a number of people listed on the screen you've seen, but I just want to acknowledge Richard Schuster, who's done a huge amount of work as part of his PhD and subsequent postdocs, Liz Clayhans, Amanda Rodewald, Tongli Wang, Peter Dunwitty, John Alexander, Tara Martin, Kate Emming, John Lawlor, and Brian Klinkenberg and Darren McConkey, all of which have contributed at different levels and are co-authors on today's talk. I'm going to start with a little bit of background that's going to give us some introduction into how we've approached this system and why we've been so interested in the Georgia Basin. Of course, a traditional goal of conservation area design has been often to go into areas that are relatively undeveloped and not much visited by humans, and to try and prioritize and conserve the last intact or relict ecosystems that are represented there. And I'm showing some examples from the central coast of British Columbia, where the Great Bear Rainforest was a good example of this, where there were multiple criteria for protecting cultural and biological resources, and decision support tools like MarkSan were used to try and prioritize different amounts of the landscape, ending up on 30% of the landscape, which is likely to give us a resilient reserve in future and focused again around recognizable, intact, and relict ecosystems. One of the things we've, of course, realized when we start working on reserve design and restoration and prioritization in human-dominated landscapes is that approach is often impractical. It's impractical because we typically have few or no benchmark ecosystems to guide us in finding those relict ecosystems that are sometimes more apparent in undeveloped landscapes. When we look to our biological survey data, especially historical data stored in museums or conservation data centers, it's often presence-only data, and as I'll show you in a minute, it can lead to bias in species distributions maps that we think can lead us to areas which are not particularly good in order to put aside, and therefore we were looking for other sources of information. And we also realized that in human-dominated landscapes there are all kinds of novel threats which we're just beginning to understand and which sometimes are hard to map because we don't have information about their distribution, things like cowbirds or overabundant species like deer, raccoons, or other non-natives which may be coming into the area. So we have attacked this program or this problem of conservation planning in human-dominated landscapes by going into a particular landscape which is dear to most of our hearts and certainly mine, having grown up in the Georgia Basin, and also recognized as being an area that's in need of conservation. I'm showing you a map of the Coastal Douglas-fir Conservation Partnership area outlined in red, which represents an area that several stakeholders have been interested in collaborating to try and further conservation, which of course continues down into the Willamette Valley, and thus the project we're going to talk about. This is a good area to work, not because it's easy to work in, but because it represents a lot of the landscapes in the Georgia Basin and elsewhere in the world where we're trying to conserve species in an already developed landscape. The area outlined in red is already 49% converted to human use. There's very little of it that is identifiable as an intact pre-settlement state. 3% is the estimate from the air, but those people familiar with those kinds of estimates will know if you walk on the ground in those places, they're often dramatically different than what we might imagine in a historical state. And a further impediment to conservation in these areas is that they typically are largely privately owned. So the area outlined in red is 80% privately owned, and that means that we can't just rely on government-owned or stewarded properties to meet the kinds of conservation goals like the 30% goals that were identified for the Central Coast. We need to think about working with private landowners to incentivize conservation. Last, it's clear that the need for conservation in these areas is very serious. We have now at least 157 species at risk identified in the region outlined, and most of you will know that the listing process often is lagging, and so many of us would imagine that the number of species at risk or potentially at risk is much higher than that. As a consequence, the Georgia Basin and Coastal Douglas-fir forests have been identified in previous surveys in BC as the most imperiled ecosystem in British Columbia and thus of high priority. But those of you south of the border and familiar with the area generally will also know that that's generally true throughout the Pacific Northwest, where there's been lots of prior work by various organizations to try and understand where and how to conserve some of the last best examples of oak ecosystems or dry forest savanna through the area. Well, what is this area then we're talking about? A little bit of natural history. I think we will recognize that in this area, soil depth plays a huge role in what we see in the dry forest. And once soils are deeper than probably a meter or so, we might expect multiple canopy forests or multi-story forests like the one I'm showing there with large firs in the foreground, which might be 400 to 600 years old. Subcanopy species like Arbutus, Pacific willow, and others that add diversity, both structurally and in terms of plant species, and then rich understory, which of course support all kinds of birds and invertebrates that give us the diversity that we are used to in the area. But what I think really makes the area special for many of us is that Those deep soil sites are often immediately adjacent to shallow soil sites. In this case, a photograph of what we would call a maritime meadow or Garry Oak ecosystem, which is just adjacent to the picture on the left is a picture on the right, where in the foreground you can find meadows which bring you to your knees in the absence of a lot of historic disturbance, have enormously diverse plant communities, and are largely maintained by drought in shallow soil, as long as you don't have herbivores at huge levels to remove those species. Now, in this system, which is very diverse as you walk across it from the shallow to deep soil sites, we're not necessarily going to expect to bring back things like marbled murrelets and spotted owls, but many of us are extremely concerned that the rates of decline of species like olive-sided flycatcher, rufous hummingbird, or many others, which those of us who've been around for a while recognize as common, even iconic birds in the region, those birds are now in decline, and we'd like to try and find out how to identify some of the last best places that still contain relatively intact communities of birds and plants, and then to, of course, work on ways to protect those in future. We also want to recognize, I think, that there's a very special history in the area. First Nations, indigenous peoples have stewarded the dry coastal forests throughout the Georgia Basin, down into the Willamette, and of course elsewhere in the Pacific Northwest. And in our area, many of the most attractive places still are clearly camas gardens of the Coast Salish, which have certain cultural history and a lot of interest because of their importance to peoples historically. Just as a little bit of background, the picture shows you a woman in the lower right having collected camas lilies during the day. You can see great camas just above that and a small island in the Southern Gulf Islands, which has a huge population of camas and is still linked to two families in the Swout and Sachem bands. In these areas, we know from the work by Brenda Beckwith and Nancy Turner in collaboration with First Nations that people harvested camas at very high rates in these areas historically, up to 400 bulbs an hour, harvesting at 1 to 2 million bulbs per 1,000 people per year, which adds up to a couple of 100 million bulbs in the Georgia Basin of BC historically. But what we also know is that these areas are, again, much changed. In this case, the graph is showing you the effects of overabundant deer on camas production, the blue line being the average size of camas bulbs planted into areas without deer because they're fenced and growing over the next 3 years. The symbols on the right, which show increase in size, versus those which were exposed to just ambient browsing, in this case on Salt Spring Island, those in the red circle on the left, which declined in size. And what this says is that there are changes in the landscape that are clearly making it very hard to maintain some of these historic elements of the landscape, which are not just important culturally, but important aspects of the overall biodiversity and system we're interested in maintaining. So again, we want to avoid these as much as possible, but surveying the entire landscape to identify all the best places has proved difficult to do. So how do we think about conserving functional landscapes in a human-developed landscape like the one I've described? Well, we still want to fall back, I think, to some of the rules of thumb we've used, but apply some slightly different tools. The first thing we'd like to do, I think, is identify some reliable predictors of the biodiversity targets at landscape scales so that we might be able to begin to map those areas that are of potential interest. After we've mapped, ideally we'd like to prioritize the relatively intact parcels or areas in the area that might be amenable to conservation over the long term or amenable to restoration because of their current condition and their potential condition in future if we do invest in restoring them. And what we've hoped to do to facilitate those two top goals is to provide open source tools to facilitate collaborative landscape planning at regional and parcel scales, which use those kinds of data in ways that facilitate decision making, and I'll show you how we've done it. Richard Schuster and I started this some years ago when Richard was starting his PhD, And we tried to ask a simple question at that time. We tried to ask, how can we identify stands that are already hosting relatively intact old-growth communities in this dry forest ecosystem? Certainly we could do that by aerial photos, which tell us about stand age, but as I've mentioned, walking into some of those older stands will convince most botanists or ornithologists or invertebrate ecologists that the areas are dramatically changed and that forest age alone is not a good predictor of whether or not we're going to have some of the rare species that might be there, like owls or murrelets, or the common species like Townsend's warblers, the salmon in the adjacent streams to these areas, or creepers, which of course are indicators of older forest. So how do we find those? Well, when we started looking for them, we went, of course, to data that was widely available. And here I'm showing you on the left one of the expert maps that was available just in 2014 from the BC government. And this is a map which shows southern Vancouver Island, and ostensibly the rough distribution, according to experts, of 157 threatened and endangered species in the area, or red and blue listed species. But you can see that it's very coarse in the kinds of scales there. The dark reddish-brown areas are at the high end of the ramp, saying there's 157 species at risk there, whereas the yellow areas are down at 2. But if we know this area and think about what it is, we know that the arrow now is pointing to Douglas and Fort in Victoria, BC, an area which at the coarse scale, of course, is not well represented as having 157 red and blue species at risk. But if we look at the little island where I showed you those earlier photographs of the Coastal Douglas-fir system, we can see that it's actually at the same place on the color ramp, just a different place in location. So the question starts to be is, how do we use these kinds of data, or can we even use it to do the kinds of planning we need to do? One can, of course, build species occurrence maps that are a finer scale, and people have often used occurrence data or presence data to do that. This is one example of a moss that was suggested to us by some botanists as a reasonable indicator of old forest. And the map, although older, shows a distribution of this moss throughout BC. But of course, to people who know the area, what it shows really is not so much where the moss is as to where people looked for it. So the red line overlaid on the dots you see there indicates that most of those observations were simply made close to the road, and we can be pretty sure that moss is present in many of the areas that it's not shown. And if we built a map on this, it'll lead us to forests with this moss, but of course those which have a lot of access and probably not the kinds of qualities we're interested in maintaining. So in this case, there are serious practical limits on the best available data or science that can be built from presence-only data. And this, again, emphasizes that we need to think about how we can identify the intact sites or relatively intact sites like the ones I'm showing you on the left, a shallow soil or a medium soil site, both outstanding examples of Garry oak savanna habitat, versus the kinds of sites you see now on the right that have very high exotic cover and richness, but look virtually the same in most of the remote sense data. So the shrub on the right is broom, which is what the one on the left would go to if under disturbance and the introduction of that seed. And the one on the top is a shallow soil meadow, which is, of course, invaded by non-native grasses and much different than it probably was in its historical state. How do we decide where these are in a large landscape? Well, certainly we can assemble experts to try and identify things from personal experience and knowledge. But in a landscape that is mostly private, that gets hard to do because we don't have access to much of the landscape. So we've taken an approach which is well developed in the conservation literature of using focal indicators that might tell us something about the integrity and health of communities of interest. And we've used birds because data is broadly available for the presence and absence of birds via databases like eBird. eBird is operated by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and is now the biggest and fastest growing biodiversity database in the world. They're getting about 4 million observations a month now of the presence and absence of birds around the world. And we, for the NPLCC area we worked in, were able to download 93,000 detections of birds of interest, and then use 27 landscape variables and some climate variables, and UNMARK, an occupancy modeling program that is widely used with presence-absence data, to map the distribution of 74 species with 50 detections or more, representing 34 families, and thus a good distribution of birds representing different life histories, different habitat affinities, and thus giving us an ability to identify communities based on the reliance of those species, which might be in relatively good shape. So how do we do that? Well, here's an example, a simplified example, applied early on in the Southern Gulf Islands and southeastern Vancouver Island to show you how it works. On the left, there are 4 occupancy maps based on presence-absence data for brown creeper, red-breasted nuthatch, yellow-rumped warbler, and olive-sided flycatcher, just as examples. We showed those. We showed the species and a whole bunch of habitat types represented in photos throughout the area to experts to ask how reliant each of a host of species, the ones noted before, were on those different habitats. And then we assembled maps, in this case composite maps, based on the weighted reliance of 20 experts who scored these species. So the schematic shows you an example of those 4 maps, but it's really 18 in this case, which are put together to create the map on the right, which is a weighted, essentially a weighted map of the probability that you would hear the full suite of birds identified as being somewhat to highly reliant on old forest. The green in this map represents those areas where you are very likely in a 10-minute point count to detect the full range of birds reliant on old forest, whereas the red indicates areas where you are very unlikely with other areas in between. So this is a heat map, or a green map really, which helps us prospect not just for old trees, but areas where we can expect to find an old forest bird community which is relatively intact and representative of what we would think should be there, and potentially if we acquired some of those areas, is likely to remain there because those areas will just get better under stewardship for old forest characteristics. We've also taken, of course, into account the possibility that climate, which is changing rapidly in the area, might have an effect on the distribution of species. And the way we've done that is by collaborating with Tong Li Wang, the author and person who maintains Climate Western North America, Climate BC. Tong Li has used thousands of presence-absence plots for a whole host of tree species in the area to characterize where those species are likely to be in the future. And so what you see in front of you is a predictive map of the climate envelope of white oak or Garry oak in the Georgia Basin at present, based on thousands of presence and absence. And you see now in the prediction for 2045 an example which is showing that in this case the Georgia Basin is actually getting slightly better for oak. You'll see again that the green represents high quality areas, and that spreads a little bit, and that's because climate projections for our region are that we're getting a bit warmer and a bit drier, which is consistent with conditions which existed historically in this area, and therefore might be a positive signal for maintaining these areas in the future. We've used those predictions of Tong Li to map our bird species currently and in the future by assuming that they will move to the same degree that the species they rely on, in this case, oak, arbutus, and Douglas-fir. We then have followed that example I showed you earlier to put together community maps not just for the small area in southern BC, but for the much larger area shown here on the left, which is our study area for the project as it's been conducted so far. And you can see we go to the northern Willamette Basin. We would like to have gone through the entire Willamette, but we weren't able to get cadastral data, property outline data for the entire area on the budget we had. So we stopped there, but as I'll say later, we can go further. So what you see here now is a predictive map of the old forest bird community, in this case including 17 species, with dark blue being areas where you are predicted to have a high likelihood of detecting those species versus a lower likelihood in yellow of detecting those species. And here is the map projected to climate in 2045, or the distribution of those 3 trees in 2045. And you'll see very little difference in those maps, and that's again because partly the time frame is short, only 25 years, and second, because areas that are already reasonably good should actually stay in oak and forest habitat in future because of climate trends. In addition to old forest habitat, of course, we wanted to represent other kinds of habitats, and we've used birds to do that as well. So here's an example of a savanna bird map, in this case just with examples, chipping sparrow, olive-sided flycatcher, and rufous hummingbird, but including other birds that people identified as savanna-dependent species. Here is a shrub prediction for the shrub nesting community and the species associated with it. Here's a prediction for the wetland community, again, many more than shown, but for the species of our 72 identified as relying on wetlands. And here is a map of what we would call the commensal or human bird communities, things like Eurasian collared dove, cowbird, and house sparrow, which in blue here, of course, identify for you some of the major metropolitan centers. Not surprisingly, the distribution of those 3 birds, and of course other things added in like rock dove, house finch, other sparrows that are, or other species that are strong human commensals, tells us very well where humans are, and potentially the areas we do not want to be engaging in too much conservation because we're likely to be overwhelmed by the indirect effects of humans and the negative species they encourage on the areas that we're trying to maintain as or restore as historic or semi-historic landscapes. Birds aren't the only thing, of course, we want to think about. We've been a little bit more limited in our data for other kinds of things, but we were able to use about 1,300 plots with the presence and absence of a whole host of species. Here showing you the 20 most common of 300 species in Garry oak meadows in relatively good shape, all natives, including species that I mentioned before, like camas, but also other species that are of importance to the cultural heritage in the area, species like serviceberry or Saskatoon, which, along with Nootka rose, were harvested heavily by historic First Nations, and chocolate lily, which is another bulbaceous species which was widely harvested. Those are areas, of course, which might look attractive to us because of the presence of those culturally important indicators of prairie habitat. And at the same time, we can develop maps a bit like the human commensal bird map, where we have mapped, in this case, not shown, but 20 of the most abundant non-native species in those same kinds of habitats, in this case, hoping to avoid the non-natives while maximizing the natives, and thus potentially finding areas of high overall integrity or natural cover. How would we actually take that next step? Well, given that we have biodiversity layers of the type I've suggested, we can combine them using spatial optimization tools to try and find out where we can maximize the targets we're interested in or that stakeholders are interested in while minimizing the various costs involved with those landscapes. And I'll explain the costs in a minute. But what you see here is the interface of a tool which you can access online and which allows you to engage in real-time analyses by setting priorities for the targets I'll mention in a moment and have mentioned a bit, and some cost layers to try and find out where you are likely to maximize targets while minimizing costs. We have hoped that this online tool, which is, again, operates in real time, is a way to engage stakeholders to both identify the targets and costs of interest and make the next step to identifying properties that they may want to try and promote action on. The goal in the current project was to prioritize 3 million parcels in the area shown to the right to try and facilitate some of these conservation decisions. And we have a tutorial available, which we think should lead most computer users through the ability to use the tool, at least in a simple way. And we have lots of examples in there of more sophisticated applications for those who want to delve in a bit more deeply. What are some of the costs we might be interested in? We know that what some of the targets might be. Some of the costs depend a bit on what you're interested in. As John said, I work with the Nature Trust of British Columbia, which is a land conservancy organization that purchases land for conservation. Thus, tax-assessed value has been a reasonable way to think about costs when they're looking to maximize benefits. And so one cost surface in the model is tax-assessed value for those 3 million properties over the entire region. Another one might be for people who are interested in minimizing contact with those human commensal species, plants and birds, which we talked about before, and try and find those areas more like the ones on the left than the ones on the right. So you can also choose a cost which minimizes the likelihood of encountering non-native plants and birds while maximizing the likelihood of encountering your target species. Last, because restoration is one of the things we're interested in, we also worked briefly with 5 land managers who regularly engage in large-scale restoration and helped us estimate the costs of reducing non-native cover and maintaining it on various sites depending on their current condition and their location. And of course, location is important in the restoration of plant communities because the reinvasion of plants by seeds from adjacent sites is likely to thwart efforts to restore, whereas those areas which are relatively isolated from those indirect deleterious effects might be more profitably maintained in the future, or at least less costly maintained. So one can also use management and restoration costs as a potential cost surface to try and find those areas in relatively good shape or relatively not costly in the future. So I'll take you through some of the choices you'd make in the tool as you were doing it. This is one of the choices you make. The first is a simple one. Would you like to use the present or future scenarios to do your mapping? How would you like to deal with initial protected areas? The tool has in it the distribution of state and federal parks, which are already there. And if you want to prioritize areas, you can either assume that they will stay there in the future and add to those ones in your targets, or you could make those available for selection and say, if we didn't have those existing parks, where would we choose to put our conservation effort? So not that we're necessarily going to sell or trade those parks, but I think it's important to know that many of the parks that now exist probably wouldn't be selected if you use it as available, because they're often in places which aren't particularly diverse, either because of human access or other reasons. You can also censor, essentially, the target maps I spoke about earlier. Those maps went from no likelihood of the community to a very high likelihood of the community. And so this slider shown here is at 50, and that just says that you want to tell the tool that you want to only use the best half of those target layers rather than get some properties where the features are a bit less well represented. So this says I want to set my targets to 50% of the best habitats. And now I'm setting you can choose your costs, and this is just an example to choose the assessed value here. And now we get to targets. So there are drop-down menus, and you can also do multiple scenarios, as you can learn in the tutorial. But this is just an example of a drop-down menu where you're entering targets, And the abbreviations here and numbers indicate that we want to have Mark Sand tell us where the best 50% of old forest bird communities, savanna bird communities, wetland bird communities, and native plant communities are in the area. And again, just using those layers where we are 50% or more likely to detect those communities. So the best half of the best communities. If we push run, it'll take in the NPLCC tool about 1.5 minutes to 3 minutes to give you a projection like the one you're seeing now. And so in this area, the green cross-hatching are areas which are not selected by Mark Sand, and the yellow-orange areas were selected by the tool and are thus those areas which maximize the likelihood of those communities just shown while minimizing the assessed value and represent areas that might be of interest for planning. Now, the pixels you'll see there in red are quite distributed. They're at a 1 hectare scale. But here I've snapped a cadastral map to it, which looks largely gray because many of those properties are very small, so their outlines are mainly showing. But what you can see is that by merging the cadastral map with a selection map, you can actually identify properties which are wholly or partly within the selection surface and thus represent potential targets, landowner contacts, etc. We can ask how well this tool, based on just birds and plants and admittedly not all of the data we could have brought in, how well it does with other kinds of efforts to prioritize the landscape. And so here's just one example. The Nature Conservancy in 2000 to 2005 engaged in a large effort with many experts and lots of data to develop an ecoregional plan to help strategic acquisition of that organization in conservation. And you can see the areas selected there in dark green as large polygons outlined by the experts. And you can see in orange the overlay. Although the overlay is only about 60%, the methods really are pretty good, and in a large part, I think, suggest that many years of careful work by experts was able to be recreated largely by the work that Richard Schuster did and that I helped him with by putting together this tool and the eBird data and plant data available to come up with predictions very similar, but also potentially highlighting areas that weren't known to the experts, maybe because they hadn't had access to them or weren't familiar with those areas. I won't show you the climate overlap, and I'll just say, as you've seen, climate maps don't change too much, and so in this case, the overlap is 96% for the current and future scenarios. Well, once you have maps like this, what would you do with them? Well, one of the things you would do, of course, would depend on who you were, but as in a simple example with the Nature Trust, we've been using it to identify and acquire biodiverse parcels at reasonable cost. So on the right, you see a map, that forest map I showed you of Salt Spring Island in British Columbia. If we'd like to minimize management costs and maximize return on investments in acquiring properties there, we can overlay that with cadastral maps, identify areas like the dark green ones, which are either existing or potential parks, and we use the tool right in its early days to help make the decision to purchase the property shown in an area where we already owned several properties, but which the tool told us which was a very, very good fit with those based on the kinds of criteria I've outlined. But I'd like to also suggest that with a group like Nature Trust, the tool is very valuable because, of course, we have the ability to identify the owners on properties adjacent to us or other properties that show promise. So rather than dealing with potentially every property on the island, we can use tools like this to develop contact lists to engage private landowners who are of particular interest to the conservation goals of the Nature Trust. The conservation or the Coastal Douglas-fir Conservation Partnership has also used the tool in a similar way, both to advise municipalities and the provincial government about conservation decisions. And most recently, we've used it to explore some of the ways in which British Columbia and the Canadian government and local municipalities might meet their commitments to the Convention on Biodiversity. That convention, which is an international treaty that Canada has signed on to, suggests that we will increase the protection of ecosystems in Canada, terrestrial ecosystems, to 17% by the year 2020. And in the area I've shown in yellow there, the Coastal Douglas-fir Partnership area, you can see the existing parks in green, which amount to roughly 9% of the area. So a question here is, how do we get from 9% to 17%? Can we do that by acquisition, or do we need to think about other ways? So the Coastal Douglas-fir Conservation Partnership got together and set targets and costs, in this case assessed value, and some of the targets as I showed you before, but including a couple others, and asked, how do we get to 17% protection? And the dark blue now are the Mark Sand suggestions for how we would add to existing reserves to gain 17% protection and meet our commitments to international treaties. Acquiring that land, however, is a different story. The assessed value is roughly $500 million, which is almost twice the size of the largest land acquisition project ever done in Canada, and of course becomes a huge hurdle in thinking about how we're going to meet that conservation target, because certainly we're not going to be purchasing that land. But one possibility is to think about taking advantage of tax mechanisms which already exist for certain kinds of land use activities. For example, you can see the purple now overlain with the blue and the green. That purple is what we call in BC the agricultural land reserve. Those are areas which have been identified as Class A farmland, and if the owners use them in ways that are consistent with tax code, they can receive an 85% reduction on their annual property tax by having modest to substantial agricultural production demonstrated. And some of those agricultural habitats, pastures and others, of course, are now surrogates for many of our shrub and grassland nesting birds. And so there might be opportunities to engage in similar mechanisms, and with the CDFCP, we've been exploring that. So we identified our priority parcels, as I've mentioned, and we've asked in this case, is there a way to shift taxes from our high biodiversity parcels, the dark blue ones which we'd like to conserve, to the lower biodiversity parcels, the ones still in yellow and not selected? And could we potentially create a mechanism to incentivize conservation on those blue lands? And because we have the assessed value and property tax information for those lands, we can at least run some pilot examples which give us some interesting results. So the blue lands, which Mark Sand identified as high biodiversity and low assessed value, and thus relatively low in property tax, are shown here as representing one efficient solution to that 70% solution. And if we were to reduce property taxes 100% on those annually, the cost to government would be about $3.1 million. But because there's a large fraction of high-value properties in yellow that are not selected, it is only a 22% increase per $100,000 value, or a 0.18% increase in property tax to pay for conservation, for $3.1 million of conservation annually. And that is an interesting idea because it suggests that tax shifting from high biodiversity to low biodiversity properties might be amenable to the people actually paying those taxes, and it might facilitate the strategic targeting of incentives at no net cost to governments, which are often concerned, of course, about reducing property taxes and the effects on revenue. We think there's even ways to be much more strategic than that, and that's because in addition to the biodiversity benefits on the lands identified, there are likely to be co-benefits, of course, in standing and sequestered carbon. We've identified some of the high-quality old forests, and of course those are including lots of carbon, and many of the regenerating forests have the potential to continue to sequester it. In our area, selected properties for old forests often have will often have a large value in their standing carbon, and in the kinds of scenarios imagined by the Canadian government where people have talked about carbon at $50 a ton by 2020. Some of the properties almost pay for themselves. But there are other co-benefits we'd be interested in, and this, of course, points to other aspects of ecosystem services. The fisheries in the area, of course, have the potential to provide recreational benefits, aesthetic benefits, and income versus sport fishing. And there is much interest in maintaining water quality and catchment. So if we could identify properties that provide those values and also the biodiversity values, we may be able to offset further some of the costs or use those tax benefits we just talked about to incentivize some of those costs, including perhaps incentivizing things like organic farmers to keep our water quality and bird and insect communities in better shape around them. Now, one of the things people have often done in this or starting to do is thinking about using auctions. Now, when we think about auctions, we often think about a forward auction when someone has something to sell and you ask buyers how much they'll pay for it. But in the tax shifting model, we actually think about it in the reverse way. Really, we think about it as governments or land conservancies wanting to buy services, in this case, partial acquisition of properties in stream buffers perhaps, or ecological services which maintain the kinds of things we're talking about, standing and sequestered carbon or water quality. In this case, what we might do then is use that $3.1 million across the targeted properties to ask who is willing and how much it would cost to deliver the services we are interested in, both those properties for their biodiversity value and their co-benefits in water quality, standing and sequestered carbon, or aesthetic or other values. What are we doing next? Well, one of the things I just want to tell you about briefly is that we spent a long time, mostly Richard, putting together those occupancy maps, and eBird data was enormously helpful in doing it. We simply couldn't have done it without that. But I'm showing you now a map that is a recent development of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology called a STEM map. And STEM maps predict species abundance for a given species, in this case Swainson's thrush, in 2-week periods over the entire annual cycle. So what you're seeing is a map based on hundreds of thousands of presence and absence observations collected by eBird over the past 25 years or so, and used to project the abundance of birds, in this case Swainson's thrushes, in every 2-week period over the year. Well, if you know where these birds are, or in this case, if you knew where 150 species that Cornell has done to date, and they should have perhaps 250 species by the end of next year, if you can overlay those birds, you don't have to do the occupancy modeling. You can simply use the STEM maps, for birds anyway, to identify areas of very high value for communities of birds that you are particularly interested in, or occasionally in particular species like Swainson's thrush where data is available. We're now working with American Bird Conservancy and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology to try and apply these STEM models, which are at a 3-kilometer scale, to parcel level selection like I've shown you in the NPLCC tool. And we think that's going to be fairly straightforward. And we're excited because we have the opportunity with the NPLCC tool to validate it and to try and help ABC, who is now trying to make decisions about property acquisition and management in some of their birdscapes, areas they've identified as high priority conservation areas. And in the map shown on the left there, you can see the Willamette Valley and the Puget Sound prairies in the north. Well, what we would like to do is initially just use that Puget Sound prairie with our NPLCC predictions to try and look at the correspondence between the STEM models and the more precise occupancy models, because if we can crack that nut, we think we'll be able to deliver a tool that anyone with cadastral data would be able to use to identify areas of high concentration of focal species of interest, potentially over the entire life cycle. Well, when we started the project, we had seen that the NPLCC had identified various needs, and some of the needs they'd identified for tools in particular were tools that helped them prioritize core areas for species or habitat conservation, tools that help them think about the effects of climate change on priority habitats or species, and in particular, tools that help organizations prioritize land acquisition and restoration strategies. And we're hoping and have had lots of encouragement from the CDFCP, who uses the tool regularly now, and now American Bird Conservancy, who is excited about using the tool in their birdscape framework. We're hopeful that we're starting to provide that. And I'll note that Richard Schuster is working with others very hard to provide an R package on GitHub that will allow anyone to build these models, given the kinds of data we've talked about. And with STEM coming forward and being freely available to users, we think that could unleash a lot of useful planning tools for people in the area. So if I can conclude, we'll just say that it's clear to anyone working in places like the Georgia Basin that humans have pervasive indirect effects and direct effects on species and ecosystems, often via the bad actors we facilitate, overabundant introduced species, which make it hard to conserve the ecosystems we're often interested in. We think that the ecosystem maps that we put together for this and other projects using bird data and plant data, and now in BC using herp and fish data that's starting to come in, offer a direct route to prioritize relatively intact target communities. And we think the tools we're developing allow stakeholders to identify those target communities and the various costs in ways that suit them, not just are dictated to them. In particular, we're excited that our tool is a parcel-level planning tool. And at the parcel level, we think that does wonders to help stakeholder engagement in target identification, goal setting, policy development, and making those landowner contacts, finding who in that phone book are the people that you really most want to contact. So with that, I will thank all of the sponsors, of course, the NPLCC, who was instrumental in delivering funding that allowed us to do the current project, the Nature Trust and NSERC, which has kept us going for a long time, the Coastal Douglas-fir Conservation Partnership, which has provided lots of impetus, and the Real Estate Foundation of BC, which has provided a bit of funding to work on the Canadian side. So thanks very much. I am eager to answer your questions as I can.
Great. Thanks, Peter. That was a great presentation. And just a reminder to everyone on the line, we're going to keep you all on mute, but feel free to send any questions you have for Peter to NPLCC staff, and then I will relay those out. So we already have one. This one came in pretty early on from Adam Novick. First, he said, thank you for the webinar. And the question, given that the PNW's oak savanna will apparently depend on continuing active management by humans, could it be misleading to characterize its conservation planning in terms of resilience, intact, and restoration, each of which can imply that an ecosystem will persist in the absence of disturbance by humans?
I mean, that's an excellent question, and it's kind of a complicated one to answer. I agree totally that many of the systems we're looking at require some kind of human intervention, and the most obvious one is First Nations burning, which would have kept many of the slopes that are now forested open in the past. And I didn't show pictures, but many people have seen them of pictures in the late 1800s versus now to know that we've already lost many of the grassland and prairie ecosystems, and fire is probably needed in many of those cases to restore them. What we've tried to do is work under the assumption that some of these areas are self-maintaining. So as I showed you, some of the maritime meadows and oak meadows we work in are maintained as long as they don't have too many invasive species or herbivores in them, simply by the fact that the species in them are highly drought tolerant. And so those bulbaceous, those geophytes like camas, shooting star, rice roots, well, not rice root, but because it's a more wet species, but others in those kinds of places are often don't need they don't need burning to maintain them because drought does it. That doesn't mean we're going to maintain savannas in deep soil systems without fire, but our first goal was just to find those places where the species are likely to maintain themselves even without lots of human input. I think a second goal would be to do exactly what Adam is suggesting, to find areas where we might actually restore and maintain, in this case with some kind of active stewardship, the suites of species we're interested in. In that case, I would say that the tool is useful because it directs you to places where those species are likely already existing. And we've found that, interestingly enough, that many of the areas we go to that are actually identified as old forest sites in the Southern Gulf Islands and southeastern Vancouver Island are actually fabulous Garry Oak sites. The air photos of Garry Oak in our area are only mapped to 2-hectare resolutions. Anything smaller than 2 hectares was left out. But because Douglas-fir has come in many of these areas in the absence of burning, walking through some of these good areas reveals all kinds of shallow soil balds and areas that probably 150, 200 years ago were open because of fire. So it's true that stewardship is going to be needed, removing trees, burning, other kinds of things to maintain some of those habitats. But we still think the tool has been really good at finding places that are candidates for that. I can't say that the same things will happen quite as well in the southern Willamette. I don't know the area as well, but it has been good in leading us to areas that are good restoration candidates, including ones that might be candidates for the restoration of fire or newer techniques like simply active thinning to keep crowns down.
Thanks, Peter. So we currently don't have any other questions in the chat box. If anyone has anything, feel free to send them. Just a reminder for everybody, we did record this today, so we'll be posting this up on our website and YouTube, and we'll make sure that everybody gets a copy of Peter's presentation slides. And if you have any questions that you think of later on, Peter, are you okay with us sending out your contact info so people can send questions to you if they have them?
Absolutely. Very much appreciate that. And you'll note on one of the slides that if you just Google Mark Sand and my name, you'll go to our site, and you'd be welcome to try the BC version of the tool, which runs very quickly and is easy to play with, I would say. And you can, of course, download the tutorials, which will give you more information. We'd be happy to talk to anyone who thinks they might have a use for the tool, because building tools that aren't used, of course, isn't very satisfying. But we've already gotten good uptake, and we're finding, and we're always eager to talk with people who have particular goals, because it helps us think about how to make refinements in future.
Thank you. Okay, we got another question from Tom Mewald. He says, thank you, and are there any plans to revise this based upon new data?
Tom, we would love to, and one of them is the STEM data, of course, and the reason is because the STEM models, provide abundance data, not just presence and absence. So a group like Partners in Flight, for example, who might have a population target, say they want to maintain 65,000 birds of species X in an area. We think that this tool, and particularly the STEM models which map abundance, can help people who have abundance targets spatialize those. And we think that they can, that at least it's a start, and particularly in areas that aren't, as we said, well surveyed, or where there's lots of private land that people aren't intimately familiar with. As far as updating or adding new data, we've done that as we can. We don't have any long-term funding for this, but we're thinking about going back to others as various users have particular kinds of goals. We have found in BC, by looking around, that there is coarse-scale data on anadromous fishes. So if you look at the BC tool, we have composite maps of 12 anadromous species. We also put together, on the BC side, critical habitat. So the Canadian government has released in our area for 12 species critical habitat maps. And so one can set additional targets, or one can simply plan for the ecosystem targets that we've done, and then the tool will report out how well those other layers were taken care of or included. I will say that the fish layers, we also have a herp layer, courtesy of Wendy Palin to Fish and Herps. But the critical habitat fish and herp layers and the other layers are enormously complementary. So one of the nice outcomes of the tool has been that even though there's good and healthy skepticism about whether birds are sufficient to plan the landscape, we've found that as we add in more data, we really don't find too many disagreements. And maybe that's not so surprising in an area like the Georgia Basin, because as most of us know, the main deleterious disturbance factors are related to humans and roads. And so often we think what Mark-San is doing with the bird communities is taking us into areas where the bird communities are intact, the plant communities are relatively intact, and not surprisingly, the streams and wetlands adjacent to those places are also relatively intact because they are all cumulatively insulated from the kinds of insults that have degraded biodiversity over time. So that's the initial answer. We'd love to do more, and we're always eager if someone can give us layers. It's easy to put layers in. It's harder to create the layers.
Thank you. Okay, so we don't have any more questions that have come in. We are at 2 o'clock now, so I'll leave this open for a couple more minutes, Peter, and we will stay on the line. We've got some comments coming in from Marion. She says, thank you. Looks forward to seeing Mark-San being widely used for planning, perhaps even by municipalities. We've got another one from Adam. Thanks again for taking my question, and thanks for your answer and all of your efforts to conserve our biological heritage.
Well, thanks. And I'll just say, just in response to Mary, we do already have municipalities using it in BC, so we would very much like to work with people who have their ideas about what they'd like to do and help them use it.
Thanks, and thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. We're really pleased to have you all on the call and the WebEx today.
Thank you very, very much.
All right, with nothing else coming through, I'm going to go ahead and close everything down. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, Megan.
The leader has disconnected. This call will now end.